Dan, what's the current state of autonomous trucking regulations and what impact will this have on the autonomy economy?
Today's regulatory structure is actually pretty favorable to autonomous vehicles. I think one of the questions we get all the time at Kodiak is a really simple question of, is what you're doing legal? And the answer is very much yes. And there are a number of different ways to look at this. But the most important is that back in 2019, the U.S. Department of Transportation issued what's called guidance, AV 3.0 guidance, that set regulations or set ground rules for autonomous vehicles. And that regulation, particularly around trucking, is actually pretty specific. It says, going forward, FMCSA regulations, FMCSA is the federal trucking regulator, FMCSA regulations will no longer assume that a commercial motor vehicle driver is always a human, or that a human is necessarily present on board a commercial vehicle during its operation. And so that really sets a foundation that says that autonomous trucks are accepted by the federal government and that they are looking to create pathways for existing regulation to comply with autonomous vehicles. And so alongside that, most of those regulations fit pretty well. The way regulation works in the US is that as long as you can comply with a regulation, your activities are presumed to be legal, that there's no sort of separate step where somebody has to sign off on what you're doing if it's a little bit outside the boundaries of existing regulations. And so we've been working for the last 5-6 years as an industry to really build a regulatory structure where we can comply with the existing rules of the road. There really are only a handful of those regulations that don't work so well for autonomous trucks. We've been going one by one trying to solve those issues. Now, I think in the long run, we're going to need a whole new set of regulations that really are built specifically for autonomous trucks and built specifically for the needs of companies like Kodiak. And I think regulators are thinking about what that pathway looks like over the next few years. But for those first few deployments, we pretty much have what we need right now.
There's a legal framework today, but then why do you get it's called the bleacher crowd that sits there and rants and raves and cheers and says that you can't do this, it's not legal? Is that just for their own agenda when you clearly have guidance from US DOT for AV 3.0? It's very clear, it's black and white as you described. Is it just cheerleaders trying to derail this technology, or is it not understanding law and understanding regulation?
I don't know really why people would say that. I would also add that alongside what the federal government has said about autonomous vehicles, you additionally have 25 states that have passed laws enabling autonomous vehicle deployment and that have specifically created regulatory structures for autonomous vehicles. And I think you could argue that the same kind of general rules apply at the state level than a federal level, that if something isn't explicitly prohibited, that it's allowed. But certainly in those states that have created those regulations, it's very clear that they want to see the deployment of these potentially life-saving technologies. So it's a little hard for me to wrap my head around when someone says just straight up, this isn't legal. And my favorite one of these is someone says that you can operate within a state, but you're not allowed to cross state boundaries. I don't know where it says that in the law. That comes as news to me. Again, I think there's still a tremendous amount of regulatory uncertainty and ambiguity around some of these pieces. And that is something that we would like to see that uncertainty decrease over the next few years. The biggest sort of blocker issues have really pretty much been solved. I think the biggest one, which I know I personally have spent a lot of time thinking about and working on, is the question of commercial vehicle enforcement. The question of how trucks will interact with weigh stations as they drive down the road and interact with commercial vehicle enforcement officers at state highway patrols. As you and many of your readers and listeners and viewers are well aware, we've been working with the Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance, which is the National Association of State Highway Patrols, for over 4 years now to develop an alternative compliance methodology for autonomous trucks that really would both create a pathway for deployment and also set new higher standards for safety throughout the industry. And the way that program works is that instead of doing what's a sort of traditional roadside inspection where an officer pulls a truck into a weigh station, gives that truck a really detailed inspection, but that happens pretty infrequently, about once a year. Instead of that once a year weigh station inspection, we have come up with a program we call enhanced inspections, where a trained and certified inspector will conduct a really in-depth inspection of a truck once a day. And that truck will be able to tell officers as it drives down the road, this is an enhanced inspection truck. It's been very, very carefully inspected by someone that law enforcement should have confidence in. And so you don't need to pull it into a weigh station. You already know that this truck is safe and roadworthy. So we think this is a really exciting model. It's certainly something other trucking companies are looking at to bring into traditional fleets. And I think it's a really good example of how the industry has worked with regulators to solve clear barriers and solve clear problems that stand in the way of deployment.
Could the enhanced inspection become the de facto trucking standard because it's such a higher level of safety versus the traditional inspection that we have today?
I don't want to speak for regulators, but I know that there are certainly components of it that I think will become much more standardized, and that law enforcement is looking at how do you take some of the concepts in the enhanced inspection and bring it into the traditional trucking fleet, because it does create a higher level of safety and it has other benefits potentially for fleets as well, as they're looking to do more things like preventative maintenance. Having that kind of visibility from a professional maintenance team into what is actually happening with every truck every day is actually really valuable. So I think we'll see some of these ideas adopted over the course of the next few years.
Kodiak has a facility outside of Dallas. You've been very kind to host me there. I went for a ride in the Kodiak truck, and it performed flawlessly. I even saw interesting things. I can't believe it. I tell my wife, and she still doesn't believe it, until we talked to a friend of ours from Dallas that there was a gentleman on a bicycle on the highway.
Oh, that happens all the time. People love biking on I-20. I don't really get that. It's hard for me to process, but lots of things people do are hard for me to process.
That's up there with weird things. Torque hosted me in Albuquerque when they showed me a guy, there's video proof of this, a gentleman was dressed up as a Burger King guy playing Frogger on the freeway. So that's out there. So the stuff that you see on the freeway is really, truly out there. As you develop with CVSA, you roll out these enhanced inspections. Does that help build trust where you operate? You operate in Dallas. Texas has really great favorable laws to autonomous trucking. Does that enhanced inspection help build that trust with the regulators and the elected officials in those states where Kodiak and your peers operate?
I think so. I think people understand that law enforcement has real expertise in highway safety and is ultimately responsible for what happens on American highways. And seeing that we're so engaged in this process to develop those solutions, I think does help build confidence in our technology and in what we're building. I think there are a few pieces to that. I think one is technology industry has this reputation of moving fast and breaking things. And I think we've really demonstrated both at Kodiak, and I'll give credit across the industry, I think this is universally the case. That's not really our approach. We move cautiously, we move fast, but relatively cautiously, and our goal is to break nothing at all. And so I think we've really demonstrated our commitment to safety by actually participating in these kinds of forums and working so closely with regulators. I think additionally, one of the things that's really unique about the trucking industry and very different, frankly, from how autonomous taxis and the passenger car industry works is that there's a whole community and ethos around safety in the trucking industry. And trucking companies understand what safety is. They understand what it looks like for a trucking company to have a strong safety culture. And I think that we've both learned a lot from our colleagues and our partners in the trucking industry from how they look at safety, from our safety drivers. We've learned a ton about what it means to build safe operations. And I think that when regulators, when our partners, when others come and actually see what we do every day at Kodiak, they understand how seriously we take safety. And they understand that we are being part of and adding to that overall safety culture. And I think enhanced inspections are a part of that as well.
I've seen your safety culture up front. I've been for rides in your truck. I've met your safety drivers, your safety engineers, and it's top priority. There's a rule in your truck. You can't talk to the driver while it's driving. And I tried. Nope, that gentleman kept eyes on the road, won't engage. There's a funny Simpsons episode where Bart tries to get the guard outside Buckingham Palace to make noise. And so I had to try that with your driver. And lo and behold, and good for Kodiak, the driver did not engage. You have the safety culture. You're working with CVSA on enhanced inspections. But today, there's a patchwork of laws. You mentioned the 25 states. There's a patchwork. In California, I don't know if it's a lost cause, but they don't seem to like anything about autonomy these days. How do you want to see the regulatory environment evolve? And will we ever get a national framework for the commercial operations of autonomous trucks?
The short answer is that this patchwork is fine for us now, but it doesn't really work for us. And that's both because while we really have on that list of 25 states that have passed regulations are almost all the states that we care about, California being a big outlier, but we'll get there someday. The reality is that trucking is necessarily an interstate business and interstate operations. And at some point, our operational design domain is going to extend past the South and into places with more inclement weather. And I think having a national framework is part of that. I also think that the federal government just has regulatory tools and has regulatory authorities that states don't have in some ways. And you really need that leadership from the federal government to make some of these pieces work. So I think that we will eventually see that. I know that the federal government, the USDOT, has these draft regulations that are sitting at the White House waiting for approval, and we're hoping that they're approved soon. And there are pieces of this that really we would like to see handled at a national level. The sort of famous warning triangle issue is another one that states really don't have authority to handle. The requirement that trucks deploy warning devices or warning triangles, reflective triangles, when they pull over to the side of the road is a really sticky and also very, very silly regulatory issue. But it's one that definitely needs to be handled at the federal level.
When we solve at the federal level, if you want to use the term national level, it's good for the economy. You and your colleagues in the industry have a great line. If you bought it, a truck brought it. That's right. A truck brought it to you. Your Amazon package originated on a truck at some point. Autonomous trucking is good for the economy. It will help usher in the autonomy economy. Before we get there, as we mentioned, regulatory has to change. How are you and your colleagues in the industry working to help usher in these regulatory changes that will benefit the economy?
We work closely with regulators, both individually and through our trade associations, groups like the AV Industry Association, Consumer Technology Association, numerous state-level associations. We also, particularly in Texas, engage directly with the Department of Transportation and Department of Public Safety. I chair the freight subcommittee of the Texas Connected and Autonomous Vehicle Task Force. And it's really amazing the community that we've been able to build up in Texas and the amount of progress we've been able to make working through these regulatory challenges as a group and developing solutions and consensus approaches to some of the issues that will inevitably come up around autonomous vehicles. Law enforcement and law enforcement interaction is highest on that list, and we work very, very closely with law enforcement around the country to help educate them about what it means to work with these trucks. But I think we're going to see a tremendous amount of progress, especially as these vehicles start to actually hit the roads.
There's a lot of misconceptions around autonomous trucking in the regulatory landscape. Is there anything you'd like to dispel for our listeners and viewers today?
The two things I'd like to dispel, the first one is this sense that there's a lot of work left to do and before we can deploy. Now, I think as we scale, there is a lot of work to do. There's a lot of work we need to do with regulators to explain this technology, to build new regulations that meet the needs of autonomous trucks and build confidence. But actually, in terms of getting those first handful of trucks on the road, I think we're pretty close there from a regulatory perspective. And that's really exciting. And I think it reflects how much excitement regulators actually have about seeing this life-saving and economy-growing technology on the road. The other issue is that we always want to dispel is it's really important to talk about how this technology is going to create jobs and is going to grow the economy, and how study after study has really shown the potential job creation benefits of autonomy. And you know this very, very well. We are excited to actually start finalizing these regulations and actually building this technology for deployment.
Autonomy is good for the economy. Autonomous trucking is good for the economy. The future is bright. The future is autonomous. The future is enhanced inspections. Dan, thank you so much for coming on the Road to Autonomy Insights today.
Thanks for having me, Grayson.